In my lecture, I will put the social situation in Germany in the foreground. In the last 60 years, German society has changed fundamentally in religious terms. It has changed from a confessionally Christian country to a multicultural and religiously plural society. Islam is one of the largest religious minorities here, with an estimated 5 to 6 million members. Against this background, from a religious education perspective, the question is what contribution interreligious learning makes to preparing young people for social coexistence. The question is then, if schools take their mission of religious education seriously, what attitudes such as openness to the questions of others, interest in the question of truth or hospitality, are conveyed in the school context or in religious education. I will deal with these in the course of my talk. The social multi-religious context in Germany with different religions and denominations requires an examination of these in confessional religious education. The question of interreligious education is a new field for the young Islamic religious education taught at German universities, especially since in the countries of origin of Muslims in Germany, dealing with other religions is not necessarily part of the curricula in these countries. But the position of Islamic religious education itself in a secular environment within society is a fundamentally new situation. Muslims live as a religious minority in a largely secular environment where Christianity is a majority religion. But the number of religiously unaffiliated people is steadily increasing. As with every religious community in our multi-religious society, Muslims also face the task of reflecting on their relationship to other religions. So far, there are no concepts developed on the basis of Islamic theology that pursue the main goal of interreligious education is Islamic religious education. In our society, school is the institution that brings together people with the most diverse beliefs. They spend a large part of their day and life together. Seen from this perspective, the question would be, how can Muslim pupils be supported in developing a respectful and appreciative fundamental attitude towards the religiously different? How can interreligious learning arrangements be designed so that Muslim students can contribute their own point of view, but also understand the point of view of a member of another religion? In my contribution, I would like to take the social situation as a starting point for my reflections. Muslims live in Germany as a religious minority. Muslim pupils who are supposed to encounter the religious other in organized interreligious learning processes mainly come from families with a migration background. This can go back to the 1970s, where their grandparents immigrated to Germany as guest workers, in the 1990s, or in the last 10 years as war refugees. Since the first PISA study, there has been a very broad discourse on migration-related issues and challenges in the social and educational sciences. Even though in recent years, intersectional perspectives have found increasing access in Protestant and Catholic religious education. This discourse takes little account of Muslims as a religious minority and the consequences for the design of interreligious teaching and learning settings in religious education. Both in interreligious learning in Islamic religious education and in cooperation projects, it is necessary to clarify beyond the curriculum, which specifies its competencies for this content area, how Islam and Islamic religious education teachers position themselves theologically in relation to other religions, and what extent these positions allow a differentiation-sensitive attitude that promotes understanding. The discussion on the topic of religion in our society are characterized on the one hand by the increasing loss of members of the two large churches and their loss of social significance for an institutionally anchored Christian religiosity. This also includes the strong individualization of religious approaches within the Christian denominations. On the other hand, Islam is becoming more and more visible as an established religious community, which can be seen, for example, in the introduction of Islamic religious education or Islamic theology at German universities in some federal states. Also, against this background of these social changes, I would like to focus my perspective on two aspects. What perception of Islam and Muslims can be observed in Germany, both by Muslims themselves and by the majority of society. Following this, I would like to discuss the extent to which these attitudes need to be addressed in religious education discourse. Now to the first question. Is interreligious content addressed in Islamic religious education? The final report on the scientific monitoring of Islamic religious education in North Rhine-Westphalia indicates that Christian content is addressed in Islamic religious education. It includes the following statements. In Islamic religious education, I have learned about the festivals of other religions, learned about the places of worship of other religions, learned about other religions, learned that Moses and Jesus are also prophets of Allah, learned that Jews and Christians also believe in God. The students surveyed gave it a medium to very high level of approval. The statements formulated in the survey initially reveal an orientation towards tradition, which refers to rituals, for example, festivals, places, for example, places of worship, or beliefs, for example, belief in God, Moses, and Jesus as prophets. The content mentioned certainly allow many parallels to be established with Muslim festivals and similarities with Islamic theological contents in the idea of Moses and Jesus as messengers of God, and formulate corresponding comparisons with the Muslim faith. However, what is missing from the study are statements concerning the extent to which different Christian perspectives were differentiated in religious education and put in relation to one's own positions. It is also not possible to see whether Islamic religious education was oriented towards the present and whether the significance of the theological content for today's Christians was discussed. Interreligious content varies enormously depending on which didactical method is used. It is learning about religion, where knowledge about religion is passed on in a religious studies style, or is it rather learning from religion, where reference is made to religious experiences and an orientation towards dialogue is recognizable? Now to the second question. How do Islamic religious education teachers perceive the discussions about Islam and their subject? The extent to which discourses about Muslims and Islam also influence interreligious exchange in the school context in general, i.e. with regard to school life and the school community as a whole, has not yet been empirically investigated. However, recent studies on Islamic religious education indicate that Islamic religious education teachers often face great challenges. In the final report on Islamic religious education in North Rhine-Westphalia, only around 27% of the teachers surveyed state that their colleagues at school were open to Islamic religious education. Furthermore, Islamic religious education in North Rhine-Westphalia report in a recently published quantitative study that there is some size hostility and complaints from the teaching staff at their school when Islamic religious education is introduced. The colleagues also try to prevent the extension of the lessons to other grades. According to statements by Islamic teachers, some school administrators argue that the staff does not agree with the introduction of Islamic religious education, but are also hostile due to their fear of the school having a negative reputation among non-Muslim parents. One teacher describes the rejection of Islamic religious education or of the teacher as a person by the school management or the staff as racist arguments with colleagues in which he and other affected colleagues not only received no support from the school management, but were even asked by them to understand their colleagues' reservations and were advised to be transferred. He describes the confrontation with these prejudices as very stressful and exhausting and feels isolated. On the other hand, Muslim religious education teachers are faced with a dilemma when the school management demands that they act as arbitrators in cases of conflict with pupils or parents and stand behind the school management in demanding that the children do not fast in school. At this point, it should first be noted that in schools seen as a microcosm of society, many Muslim religious teachers are still far from being seen as equal members of the school community and being recognized accordingly. What is the perspective of Muslim pupils? For most children growing up in Germany, it is normal for their circle of friends to include members of different religions, but also secularly oriented people. According to studies, interreligious and intercultural aspects are mixed, because pupils do not consider religious and cultural backgrounds, and young people discuss with their friends. According to studies, interreligious and intercultural aspects are mixed because pupils do not consider religious and cultural backgrounds in a differentiated way. Religion and faith are also not among the topics that children and young people discuss with their friends in everyday life, even if the friends belong to a different faith community. In her qualitative study with pupils in Islamic education in Bavaria, Selcan Güzel found that the pupils interviewed were basically very open to religious, cultural, and ideological diversity. However, they also state that their parents do not always approve of their open attitude. 80% of the pupils state that they have not yet had a school project at their schools that dealt with getting to know different religions, worldviews, and cultures. Without making sweeping generalizations, this shows the tendency that religion is excluded from the school context on two levels. On the one hand, on the pedagogical teaching level, but on the other hand, on the interpersonal level. Muslim pupils also report personal experiences of discrimination, such as bullying, insulting their religion or their origin, which they describe as an emotional burden. They perceive the negative portrayals of Islam and Muslims in their environment as stressful. In the school context in particular, Islamic religious education seems to be a safe space where such experiences can be addressed in soothing and protected setting. How do children and young people with a Christian social background view their Muslim classmates? To what extent can exclusionary attitudes towards Muslims also be ascertained among them? So far, little research has been done on the relationship between Christian religiosity and Islamophobia or Muslimophobia in the young generation. In Germany, young people are considered to be less prejudiced than older people. However, the fact that Islamophobia and Muslimophobia also play a significant role at a young age is shown by the study by Kador and Karabulut in a non-representative study. They interviewed 500 young people from the rural area at general and vocational schools in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Non-Muslim pupils then stated the following. They do not necessarily deal with the topic of Islam at school, but encounter it mainly in the mass media and in social networks and on the internet. They do not talk much about Islam with their friends and family. They state that Muslims are mainly encountered at school with 95%, 89% in social networks, 78 among friends, 71 in leisure time, and 63 in the neighborhood. They state that Muslims are their best friends with 40%. They have more knowledge about Islam as a religion or doctrine than about the reality of Muslim life. The results show better results about the everyday life of Muslims when there is contact with Muslim people in the circle of friends or in leisure time. It can be concluded from this knowledge about Islam is part of general knowledge in the migration society, while knowledge about the reality of life is at least partly acquired through encounters and conversations. They make less sweeping judgment about Islam, provided they are friends with Muslims and have more insight into the lives of Germany. Pupils with a strong Christian faith are more negative towards Islam, especially in the dimensions of attribution of identity threat and attribution of Islamism. In summary, it can be stated at this point that knowledge about Islam is produced or reproduced in media, political, educational, and religious education discourses that contain stigmatizing images, discriminatory stereotypes, and prejudices about the Muslim and the Islam. This clearly shows the great challenges facing comparative theologically oriented religious education, which may hinder it. Now taking a new perspective. What goals are achieved with interreligious learning in Protestant and Catholic religious education in relation to interreligious learning? So far, there are few empirical studies dealing with the effectiveness of interreligious learning arrangements. Alexander Unser looks at 8 studies on Protestant and Catholic religious education according to the 5 goals of interreligious learning. Joachim Willems summarizes the goals belonging to interreligious competence as a consensus within the literature on interreligious learning. These include 1, clarification of one's own position, 2, the acquisition of basic knowledge of religious studies, 3, the acquisition of hermeneutic skills, 4, the ability to meta-communicate when dealing with others, and 5, the change of attitudes as an example of active, strong tolerance and empathy. The analysis of Unser shows that the available findings give reason to assume that interreligious learning in Protestant and Catholic religious education succeeds in imparting knowledge about non-Christian religions to pupils and enabling them to understand foreign religious concepts and statements of faith. The ability to adapt perspectives and change attitudes could not be answered unambiguously on the basis of the findings. In summary, it can be cautiously said, on the basis of the few empirical studies, that in interreligious learning settings in Protestant and Catholic religious education, but also in Islamic religious education, there is at least an increase in knowledge about other religions. Thorsten Knaut and Rainer Möller rightly criticize the fact that at the beginning of an interreligious encounter between Muslims and Christians or with Islamic content, the Christian pupils are not confronted with some foreign religion. The foreign suggests that one knows little about the others and covers up the fact that there is already a great deal of socially racist structured knowledge about the others. In this case, about Islam and Muslims. In the case of Muslim students, it would be necessary to clarify what effects it has for interreligious learning settings to bring their experiences of exclusion, discrimination, and attributions as the others into society. The axis of difference in Germany is not only between Christians and Muslims. The Christians are the natives, while the Muslims form the group of immigrants. The axis of difference is therefore not only between religions, but between ethnically, socially, and culturally differently positioned interlocutors. Therefore, the question is also to what extent Muslims and Christians also differentiate between experiences with members of the majority society who can be both secular and members of a religious community. And how can pupils be enabled to reflect on their own attitudes and, building on this, to develop a position towards the religious other that is capable of dialogue. Interreligious education in a plural society must have the goal of promoting the judgment and difference competences of the pupils in such a way that they are empowered at all levels of social interaction with members of other religions or worldviews. Both similarities and differences must be recognized, named and understood in their own religious meaning. Practicing a culture of dispute that recognizes the other is central here. In view of the political and social challenges, all religious communities bear a joint responsibility for publicly effective interreligious education, especially at a time when religious education in schools is increasingly being called into question. If one takes seriously the results of the studies that people who have contact with Muslims show fewer Muslimophobic and Islamophobic tendencies, then in future, religious education can think more about approaches in which Muslims can bring in their perspective as subjects and interlocutors. This is an important aspect that leads to the question, what possibilities does comparative theology open up? I would like to comment on a few aspects. Comparative theology is interested in individual cases of theology of religion and their relevance for interreligious dialogue. In doing so, it claims we develop an interreligious hermeneutic that allows, on the one hand, to maintain one's own claim to validity. On the other hand, it is also about giving space to the perspective of others and taking their own interpretation seriously. The essential goals of comparative theology can be summarized as new understanding of one's own, appreciation of the foreign, and search for truth. Let us look at the school situation, for example, in North Rhine-Westphalia. If there are Islamic religious education classes at a school, there is usually at least one Protestant or Catholic religious education class. From a school organizational point of view, it is therefore necessary that the two religious education classes cooperate with each other and strive for encounters with the other religion in phases within the confession-oriented religious education classes. Comparative theology regards the participants or the religions as equals. In this sense, this framework opens up the possibility that Islam or Muslims as a minority are not, as is so often the case, approached unilaterally by the majority, but then both religions encounter each other on an equal footing in didactically designed learning arrangements. In this way, the setting shifts the dominance and power imbalance of Christianity towards cooperation in partnership, so that both religions share responsibility for publicly effective interreligious education. The aspect of appreciating the stranger challenges those involved in comparative theological situations to expose themselves to the otherness of the other, to want to understand it and to accept it in its otherness. However, this also requires time if another foreign religion is not only to be grasped from the outsider's perspective, but its members are also invited to present the internal perspective. This internal perspective of the other can appear alien to the pupils or as a contradiction to their own position if it's also used in relation to their own religion. In such encounters, emotions and reactions are to be expected from the students, which make it clear it cannot only be about cognitive learning, that means the acquisition of knowledge. Rather, the existentially and effectively significant role of religious convictions and one's own religiosity must be considered pedagogically. In the sense of comparative theology, a micrological approach can be taken in order to design religious or interreligious learning processes using exemplary content. The focus is not on Islam or Christianity, but on individual theological approaches, traditions, or rituals that show a perspective on the respective religion. From a religious didactic point of view, such a setting would initially be a learning about religion in which pupils can acquire concrete knowledge about exemplary traditions of others or their everyday pattern of action. Turning to the individual case makes it possible to dig deep into the pupil's point of view and experiences of the world in which they live, in the sense of learning from religion. An empathetic attitude requires at least that students let the foreign tradition approach them, show openness or empathy to some extent. In didactically designed sequences, comparative theological approaches open up the possibility of discovering the plurality of identities, of perceiving the members of the other religion not as a homogeneous group, but in their heterogeneous facets. In the sense of the theory of social identity, there would be the possibility, at least theoretically, if similarities being recognized as a unifying element in attitudes and beliefs. Similarity can be understood as a dynamic concept that emphasizes connections and unifying elements. As a counter-design to difference, similarity takes into account commonalities, overlaps, and parallels, and has the potential to soften rigid boundaries, dichotomies, and hierarchies. However, similarity should not be misunderstood as a harmonization concept. Rather, it can shake the supposedly stable, natural dichotomous orders in the consideration of the other. According to social identity theory, rigid group boundaries can be softened if similarities and commonalities between individuals of the in-group and the other group, the out-group, are made visible. It can shake group boundaries when students can understand their life-enhancing potentials in a conversation about two religious traditions. These life-enhancing potentials can only be accepted if they appear logical, understandable to the person. Such an approach would then also pose the question of truth, which does not have and cannot be answered systematically, but is discussed precisely on the micrological level in the sense of comparative theology. In my presentation, I have tried to show that when planning interreligious learning units between Muslims and Christians, it is also important to take the social situation into account. And thank you for your attention.